Dr. Raad Alkadiri, Managing Director, Energy, Climate and Resources at the Eurasia Group. Raad, this is a very unique geopolitical moment in time that it seems to me the oil industry are ignoring at their peril, all for one and one for all, but meanwhile, there's bombs dropping on European cities. I'm wondering from your perspective, the overarching question we're starting with today, can the oil industry and oil countries continue to ignore this context and there be no consequence for them? Your thoughts?
Look, I think you're already seeing the pressure that is arising from OPEC Plus's policies, particularly in terms of the tension between Saudi Arabia and the United States. And the fact that the Saudis, in Western eyes are supporting a war in Ukraine. I think that's a false narrative, but under the current circumstances, it's one that certainly opens itself up, especially as you have Western governments trying to limit profits and limit revenue going back to Russia as it continues with this war. I think we're seeing it playing out inside the US tension and the geopolitical consequences. I think, it is very difficult for oil producers to traverse through what is a fraught geopolitical environment. And it is one of those times when it does expose the differences between the national security goals of Saudi Arabia and other OPEC producers and the national security goals of the United States and some of its Western allies. And I think the view from the Gulf, and not unfairly, is that this is a European war. And when wars happen elsewhere around the world, it doesn't sort of create quite the same context in terms of oil production, in terms of prices, etc. And I think that's a valid argument, and it's one that extends more broadly, I think, the impact of this war into creating divisions between industrialized countries and emerging markets, in the sense of emerging markets being asked to explain why they are carrying some of the costs of Western sanctions without necessarily being brought into the discussion about how they're going to be implemented.
I'd like to just bring you in on that to speak to consequences or impact for the Russian-Ukraine war. You said earlier, this is not OPEC's war. It's not the Gulf Middle East war. Why should they have a position that would take, essentially, I don't want to paraphrase you too much, but ultimately you were giving them a pass, it sounds. But ultimately they are part of a group called OPEC Plus, in which one of the protagonists, the major protagonist in this war, is Russia. And by defending a $90+ oil while the Western alliance is trying to bring in an oil price cap, I mean, clearly these are opposing positions, whether they're optically opposing or literally opposing. And surely, as it's said by the US president and administration, there will be consequences.
I think, as I said before, the Saudi-US tension is a manifestation of the consequences you're talking about. I think it's separating the geopolitical consequences of events that are taking place and would take place and would have consequences, anything, from the price of oil. No US administration is going to be happy when petrol prices are going up domestically. It's a reality. The US appears to believe that it has an unwritten part of its constitution that says, thou shalt have very low energy prices, very low petrol prices from here till kingdom come. And I can the Biden administration is not the first administration to I think, get antsy about this or to make threats about this. I think the other thing is it predates Ukraine. I mean, the interventions using the SPR started last year, so it's not something that's brand new right now. My question ultimately, from a geopolitical analysis of the Ukraine, does it embolden the Russians and Putin to continue to be more robust in their engagement because of this division that is emerging between the oil producers and the West? I don't think it does that, Sean. I think the big question is, if you want to deny Russia revenue, if you want to undermine its war effort, what measures are you willing to take to do that? At this moment in time, you have US administration and, quite frankly, the EU as well, that wants its cake and wants to eat it too. It wants to put measures on Russia. It wants to reduce oil prices. It wants to see somehow sort of various oil producers step up and pay that price purely and simply because it isn't willing to sanction Russia. The easiest way to do this is sanction Russia. Then you face $200, $250 a barrel oil.
Raad, what was your takeaway from China? Obviously, I heard your boss Ian Bremmer saying that Xi is now the most powerful person in the world. It certainly was a more robust kind of, maybe than even some were expecting, posture elevation from the Chinese. And since the meeting, we've had the Chinese foreign minister come out and essentially deepen the relationship with Russia, accuse US and NATO of cornering Moscow, that whatever gap may have appeared in that meeting in, was it Kazakhstan or the Shanghai meeting, where the Chinese expressed some kind of token of concern about the war in Ukraine. This seemed to consolidate that this bond with Russia and China is very deep. What's your takeaway from this Congress?
I think your point about it being a robust China, an ambitious China that intends to be a great power and step up and play that great power role, and that Xi is going to push that policy, and that is going to be the bedrock of his policy, was something, I think, the biggest thing that came out of this. The fact that he's put in place a set of individuals around him now who are loyalists, who are sort of very much in the Xi camp and will back this policy and back his elevation is important. He becomes probably the most powerful man in the Chinese Communist Party since Mao, which is not an insignificant standing. But I think there are other things that come out of it from an energy standpoint that are worth watching. And a lot of that has to do with the growth policy that was being discussed. I think a recognition by the Chinese that you don't get to the high single-digit growth again, and a sense of trying to dampen that, but an emphasis on the quality of growth rather than the pace of growth. And that feeding into this common prosperity policy, which Xi has reinforced, and the notion of trying to deal with inequality in China. And where that is going to matter, I think, from an energy perspective in the longer term, is going to be on the emphasis on environmental policy. I mean, China is still the biggest spender on renewable energy in the world, and that looks like it's going to continue. And so that, beyond the sort of desire to get fossil fuels and hydrocarbons and to move forward, I think that emphasis is important in terms of signaling a direction for China, signaling what it means for global demand over the medium to long term, and where the direction we may be going in the shorter term. And this wasn't necessarily linked to the party Congress, but I think the NRDC's statement about not selling on and not selling on LNG cargoes from now on is going to start to have an impact much more immediately on European gas prices and on gas prices around the world. So that's something to watch in terms of tension. But from a geopolitical context, and this is a China that is robust, assertive, and looks like it is going to be in conflict with the US. I wouldn't put so much on the Russia relationship. I still think that the Russia relationship for China, I mean, China isn't going to align itself with the West on this, and China is going to offer Russia a certain amount of respite. But it's not necessarily a China that thinks that the invasion of Ukraine was a good idea and the continuation of the war was a good idea. But let's face it, China is the strategic beneficiary of Russia's mistakes in Ukraine, and certainly from an energy perspective. What China has in Russia now is essentially a supplement. Russia has very, very few other places to sell its energy long term. And that, from a Chinese economic and energy perspective, means that it has a great deal of leverage.